All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. I will try again. All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Thanks so much for being here at our very special seminar. And thank you for coming in at a different time than normal, and I appreciate that. So just a reminder, just like our normal seminars, this is a hybrid event. So we have folks online and folks in the room. For those folks that are online, we do have your cameras, mics, and screen shares disabled. But just like always, we have our wonderful volunteer Roseanne here to help us out. So if you have any technical issues or you have any questions for today's speaker, please put them into the chat box, and she will get those taken care of for you or read them out for our speaker today. For folks in the room, like we always do, because it's a hybrid event, you will need a microphone to ask any questions. So when we get to that section where it's question and answer, I just ask you to raise your hand and be a little patient with me, and I'll bring the mic around. But again, thank you so much for being here and being a part of this particular event. I want to do one quick announcement for next week. We'll resume our normal seminar time on next Thursday, but next week's speaker is Laura Gable, who is a coastal field geologist with Dagami, and she's going to be talking about evaluating the tsunami vertical evacuation in Seaside. So if anybody knows about how that works, Seaside has been one of those model communities where we worry about people's ability to get to high ground. And so they're evaluating a building like this or something similar in that space to help with that. And so she's going to talk to us about where they're at in that community effort. So join us again next week. But I'm going to hand this off to Bob. Bob is our director and the AVP of Research and Marine Operations with Oregon State University to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Cinnamon. Thank you. Yeah, it's really with excitement that I get a chance to introduce our speaker today. Is our inaugural Lavern Weber Prize winner, and the just a little background on that. Lavern Weber, for those who are relatively new, so the last 10 or 15 years here, was our first resident director at Hatfield, and he was actually director for about 25 years. And in the time that he was here, he was very instrumental in developing the sense of collaboration, the feeling of community that is really what defines OSU and particularly Hatfield. And to that, he was very instrumental in bringing a lot of different research groups together. And so that's kind of the spirit in which the Lavern Weber Prize was built on. And so our candidate this year, selectee, is I'm really happy to have him here. Rod Fujita is a past alum of Hatfield, and so I think that to me is one of his greater attributes. But he also, just a little bit of a background about him, he got his PhD at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, and then with a very broad experience across different marine environments, from the temperate, high upwelling environments to coral reef environments. He is currently the Associate Vice President and Director of Ocean Research and Development for the Environmental Defense Fund. And this is really a nice opportunity for us to bring an NGO perspective, someone who brings very strong connections to science, to dealing with conservation issues and policy. He's co-founded the EDF Oceans Program, which has currently grown to over 100 different staff and scientists around the world. It's a really impressive program, and hopefully you'll have a chance to, or you can have a chance to talk to him about it a little bit. He's authored over 80 peer-reviewed journals and has written 2 books. One is Heal the Ocean, Solutions for Saving Our Sea, and fairly recently co-authored on Making Shift Happen, Designing for Successful Environmental Behavioral Change. And I note that this particular book received the 2023 Gold Medal Nautilus Book Award. So on top of that, he's also a Pew Fellow, and now one of the most prestigious prizes, the Lavern Weber Prize. So again, let me introduce.
Thanks. Thanks, Bob. Thank you very much, Bob, and thanks to you all for being here. I want to talk today about a project that I'm doing now that actually was hatched about 40 years ago here at the Hatfield Marine Science Center. It's here, and the research I did here as a postdoc that really cemented my interest in seaweed and how amazingly fast they grow, how productive they can be, how they can take nutrients out of the water, how they can reverse acidification, all these benefits that seaweed can bring, I studied here. I took a detour for about 35 years to work on fisheries and MPAs and pollution and acid rain and a number of other issues while working at the Environmental Defense Fund. But I'm really happy now, near the end of my career, to be back in the seaweed business. And I want to tell you about what we're doing these days. So the summary of this talk really is, yes, there's an urgent need to mitigate climate change. And that involves both a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and also, at the same time, the active drawdown of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere if we're to meet our global commitments and achieve our targets and, most importantly, avoid even more severe impacts of climate change. Now, there's a class of approaches for taking carbon out of the atmosphere called nature-based climate solutions that I'm going to kind of focus on today. And several of these nature-based carbon solutions are based on ocean processes because the ocean, as many of you know, is our largest reservoir of carbon on the planet, and it already takes out 2 or 3 gigatons of carbon per year from the atmosphere and sequesters it. And I want to focus among those nature-based carbon solutions on seaweed systems because of all the attributes I just described. So let's first describe, this is going to be old hat for many of you, I know, but the so-called blue carbon systems are those which are particularly good at taking up carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it somewhere. So in the near shore, you've got mangrove forests that take CO2 directly out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. They make it into wood, which lasts a long time. They make it into roots and rhizomes in low oxygen soils, which lasts an even longer time. And over hundreds and even thousands of years, that turns into peat, which is pretty much sequestered, right, over millennia. So that's a great blue carbon system. Seagrass meadows work in a similar way, except, of course, they're taking the carbon dioxide out of solution in the seawater. So there's an extra step wherein that carbon absorption through photosynthesis in the water by seagrasses creates a disequilibrium, a difference in the concentration of carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the ocean, and that drives uptake. The seagrasses don't make wood, but they make biomass, right? Some of which is grazed, some of which is respired back into the sea and then goes back in the atmosphere. But a fraction of it does turn into roots and rhizomes and sediment, so it stores some carbon like that. Salt marshes, similar thing, right? Take atmospheric carbon, turn it into biomass, eventually turn it into roots, rhizomes, and peat. In the open ocean, things work a little differently, right? There are no big woody plants. The sediment is, hundreds of meters below the surface water. And so the mechanisms by which carbon is absorbed and sequestered are quite different, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And then finally, we'll talk about seaweed systems, which are also different because seaweeds, while they absorb carbon from the seawater and therefore have to drive that disequilibrium to result in drawdown from the atmosphere, also don't make wood, they don't make roots, and they don't make much peat, of course. So they work in a different way. So in order to navigate through the complexity and to start to bring what we know about the scientific foundation of these processes into the policy arena and help decision makers make rational decisions about what to do about drawing carbon out of the atmosphere, We evaluated all these systems across these different criteria. So we convened a whole bunch of experts. We had them map the systems composed of the carbon pools and the fluxes in each of these systems, and think hard about all the different pathways that the carbon could take so that we could have a relatively complete picture of carbon dynamics in these systems. And then we asked the experts about, well, given that understanding, what can we say about the potential of that system to mitigate climate change? How much carbon is it able to take out per unit area? And then when you multiply that by the total area occupied by that system, how much carbon is that? Is it big or small? Is it at the gigaton level or at the 1,000-ton level? We also asked questions about ecological risk. So how safe is this approach relative to ecological impact? What happens when you restore a mangrove? Is that positive or negative for the surrounding ecosystem and for fisheries? When you conserve a seagrass meadow, is that positive or negative? We also looked at socioeconomics because people are an essential part of this equation. We need to care, we do care about risks to social and economic systems, to communities, particularly those that are highly vulnerable to climate change, where a lot of these blue carbon systems are, right, in the nearshore tropical environment. And we also asked these experts to assess the feasibility of implementing these things. How hard is it to create the political will, get the money together, and actually implement one of these pathways? So after this evaluation, these experts landed on these priority blue carbon systems. First, everybody thought that conserving the mesopelagic system was a real winner, even though, and this is important, even though uncertainty was very, very high. So we surveyed the literature, we asked these experts, and everybody agreed that even though we don't know how much carbon is stored in the mesopelagic system, and these are the midwater fishes and squids and jellies and that whole ecosystem that lives in the twilight zone between 200 meters and about 1,000 meters, we did know that it was huge. And we also knew that it played an important role in pumping carbon from the atmosphere into the surface water, into the deep ocean for sequestration. So because there's not much of a mesopelagic fishery yet, the socioeconomic risks were low of conservation. And we had an opportunity, if we could develop the political will and the financing, to create governance capable of protecting this mesopelagic system, to have a very high leverage intervention, right? Low cost, high benefit. So feasibility seemed high. Around seabed carbon was another blue carbon pathway that was deemed by these experts to be pretty high leverage. This involves higher socioeconomic risk, though, because there's a lot of trawling going on in the ocean, which generates economic value and jobs. Many people's livelihoods depend on that. And increasingly, there's deep sea mining, which is important for the green economy. That's where a lot of the critical metals that are going to drive battery development and all these things are. And so while the risks were higher, the potential benefit was also deemed to be high because there's a tremendous amount of carbon stored in those bottom sediments for millennia. And these activities like trawling and deep sea mining disturb that, and eventually that carbon mixed up into surface water, some fraction of it, and then some fraction of that will go back into the atmosphere. So these experts deemed that that risk was worth mitigating despite the socioeconomic risks associated with that. And finally, conserving seabeds was deemed, seaweed beds was deemed to be a relatively high leverage action, but one that would not result in a whole lot of carbon sequestration, despite the fact that seaweeds absorb carbon very rapidly. And this is because of what I mentioned before. They don't make wood. They don't store carbon in the sediments. They're great at absorbing carbon. They're not great at capturing it and sequestering it. And also, seaweed beds like mangroves and seagrasses and salt marshes are all limited in scale, right? They are champions at absorbing carbon, and mangroves and seagrasses and marshes are great at sequestering carbon at very rapid rates. But when you look at the world ocean, they're confined to this tiny margin of shallow water habitat because they need light, right? And some of these have roots. So they need to be in shallow water. They need to be in the appropriate kinds of habitat, which are relatively scarce when you look at the entirety of the ocean. So even if you have a high carbon sequestration rate, when you multiply that by a small spatial area number, you get a small number for climate mitigation potential. The scientific foundations of these pathways vary, and so the levels of uncertainty vary as well. Restoring mangrove forests is among the best understood of these blue carbon pathways. They're easier to study than submerged ecosystems. You can walk around in them. You can put greenhouse gas sensors on them. You can measure the wood accretion rate. You can do cores and get sediment carbon. So we know a lot about carbon dynamics in mangrove forests. But again, as I said, the potential climate mitigation, despite the very rapid rate of carbon sequestration in these forests, is limited by their need for shallow water habitat, intertidal habitat. They also, because they're low oxygen environments and high in carbon, tend to emit methane. And because of the interface of the land and the sea, they receive a lot of nitrogen loading. So if there's agriculture, if there's acid rain with nitrogen in it, those mangroves are going to process that nitrogen, and some of it's going to be denitrified partially to nitrous oxide, which is another powerful greenhouse gas. So you have, when you're restoring a mangrove forest, you have to weigh the benefits of taking that carbon out of the atmosphere against the emission of these powerful greenhouse gases. And sometimes it may not make sense from a climate mitigation point of view. It might be climate neutral. Other times, the hydrology, the sediments, the oxygen levels might be such that the methane and the N2O emissions are minimized. So you get a lot of climate mitigation in that case. So very context-specific research is necessary to understand these dynamics and get a true accounting of the climate mitigation potential of these systems. The risks are low, right, of restoring a mangrove forest. It's good for people, it's good for nature, and we know mangroves are important as nursery habitat for young fishes. They support huge amounts of biodiversity. So those ecological risks are low, but because of this greenhouse gas emissions problem from mangrove forests, which are not typically measured in mangrove restoration projects, people are already selling carbon credits based on only the carbon absorption. So they're missing part of that equation, and that results in a low integrity carbon credit, right? Because you're not counting all the gases that contribute to climate mitigation. So what do we need to solve some of these challenges? I think we need a lot of low-cost sensors. Right now, it's very difficult to measure those greenhouse gas emissions in a mangrove forest. They're muddy environments. You have to lug, this big, heavy, portable greenhouse gas analyzer out there. The chambers are really expensive and fail. They're not kind of frail, So we need, in order to get a much better picture of the spatial and temporal variation of these greenhouse gases and to characterize those flux rates to get a true accounting, we need really inexpensive solid state sensors and robust gas exchange chambers that maybe we're developing some with Stanford University are going to come in at about $300 per sensor. That's a price point that makes it possible for local environmental groups and community groups and governments to put these all over the place to get a more synoptic measurement of these greenhouse gases. Conserving mesopelagics, like I said before, we don't know a heck of a lot about carbon dynamics in the system. Really, really hard to study, although I know scientists here at Hatfield are making huge progress in characterizing the phytoplankton and zooplankton communities typical of this system that are so important in that biological carbon pump. It is a high leverage opportunity to conserve blue carbon with little socioeconomic risk. And what we need here is just a gigantic investment in our ocean observing system and more science to characterize those carbon dynamics and quantify them more accurately. And then seabed carbon, similarly, there's a lot of uncertainty around the amount of carbon that's in the sediment, and there's quite a contentious scientific debate right now about how to model that carbon release, because there's many steps. It has to be disturbed, and then what fraction of that carbon gets into the water column, what fraction of that carbon gets ventilated into the surface water from down deep. A lot of unknowns there. We already talked about the socioeconomic impacts, and what we need here are just more samples of sediment carbon and a better characterization of those ventilation rates, and so that we can better estimate how much of that carbon is being released when it's disturbed. So I'm going to skip these because I talked about that yesterday and go right into what I'm currently fascinated with, which is the potential of seaweed farming. Now, out of all those blue carbon projects, they all cost money, right? You have to, if you want to restore a mangrove forest, if you want to put a seagrass meadow back to a pristine condition, if you want to restore a salt marsh, and even if you want to conserve sediment blue carbon and those plastics, you're talking about costs to people, and that's a barrier to change. So at EDF, we always look for kind of win-win solutions. And when you look across that spectrum of solutions, seaweed farming emerges as a potential winner because even though seaweed beds naturally don't sequester carbon, the fact that seaweeds can absorb carbon rapidly means that if you farm them, you can capture that carbon and do other things with it that can either store that carbon, right, or mitigate other greenhouse gases. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. I also want to point out that of all those solutions, this is the only one that actually makes money. It's profitable now. And so even though we're uncertain about the carbon sequestration benefits of seaweed farming, it's gravy, right? It's just an add-on to the already profitable enterprise of seaweed farming. And finally, it is much more scalable as a climate solution than the other blue carbon solutions. Unlike mangroves and seagrasses and salt marshes, seaweeds, because they have no roots, can grow anywhere in the ocean where there's enough light and nutrients to support their growth, right? And the only constraints are conflicts with fishing grounds, with shipping channels, right? You don't want to put seagrass, you don't want to farm seaweeds over coral reefs because that would shade them. There's also some nutrient competition with natural phytoplankton species that you want to avoid. So there are constraints. We're not going to grow seaweed all over the place. But when you analyze spatially and overlay all those constraints, you still come up with a couple of million square kilometers of potentially farmable area in the ocean that meet all those constraints. So it's got some advantages as a climate solution. The way it works, again, is the seaweed take up the carbon out of the seawater. That creates a disequilibrium in carbon concentration between the ocean and the atmosphere. Under some conditions, this results in a flux of carbon from the atmosphere into the ocean to replace that carbon that was removed. But this is a huge uncertainty that needs much more research and better sensors so that we can measure that flux. Right now, it's calculated from equilibrium chemistry. And we're making a lot of assumptions that that drawdown occurs. There's only been a few measurements with things called eddy flux covariance towers, very expensive technology to measure these fluxes. So again, there's a need for a simple, robust way to measure those fluxes so we can get a better handle on the conditions under which there actually is drawdown when you're growing things in the water. There's also a lot of food web dynamics that occur in a seaweed farm, just like in a natural seaweed bed. So everybody likes to eat seaweed. There's a lot of grazers. And of course, the animals that eat the seaweed convert the carbon that's been absorbed by the seaweed back into CO2 and animal biomass. That goes back into the surface water. Some fraction of that goes back into the atmosphere. So it's not really sequestering any carbon. It's only that fraction of the seaweed farm biomass that gets eroded and makes it down through the water column without getting grazed or decomposed by microbes that actually sequesters in the deep ocean or in the sediment. And there's also some fraction of the dissolved organic carbon that's released by seaweeds, mostly polysaccharide compounds. Some of that is eaten by microbes and remineralized to carbon, but some fraction of it, and it depends on the species, some fraction it seems to be very refractory to microbial decomposition. So that's another pathway by which the carbon absorbed by the seaweed can be sequestered. Now, I mentioned that one of the reasons I'm excited about seaweed is that although seaweed absorb carbon fast, they don't sequester the carbon very well for all those reasons, right? But it's a crop. So you can harvest the seaweed, take the carbon that the seaweed absorbed out of the ocean, remove it from the food web so it's not remineralized by all those animals and microbes, and turn it into medium density fiberboard and make things out of it. You can make adobe bricks out of seaweed that store the carbon on a decadal timescale. There's some new companies that are making plastics out of seaweed to replace the petroleum-based products that we use now. That would result in a big savings in greenhouse gas emissions associated with making those products. It's also quite possible to make biogas and biofuel out of seaweed that are very energy dense, but they're too expensive right now relative to the cost of the fossil fuel analogs. And one that I'm particularly interested in is these properties of seaweed extracts called biostimulants, which are quite popular in the farming community and among horticulturalists because even without adding more nitrogenous fertilizer, if you add the seaweed extract, you get a 30–40% bump in yield, and your tomatoes look beautiful and they're delicious. So people love this stuff. It's already a market. It's a multi-million-dollar market. And so that removes a barrier, right, to scaling. And this is what we're always thinking about at EDF when we're bringing science to action is like, what are the barriers to action? How does science inform decisions? And then finally, I'll mention this kind of promising avenue. A few years ago, it was discovered that certain species of red seaweeds, particularly this one called Asparagopsis, when fed to cows as only about 1 or 2% of its feed, can result in reduction in methane emissions from rumination by about 80 or 90%. So very significant suppression of methanogenesis in the cow rumen. There's also some little bit of evidence that those same compounds, the bromoform compounds in seaweeds that suppress methane in cows, also can suppress methane from manure ponds, which is another huge source of methane. So cows, manure ponds, rice paddies, big sources of greenhouse gases. And if we can remediate methane, because methane is shorter-lived gas in the atmosphere, and because it traps much more heat than carbon dioxide per molecule, it gives us a head start. And it can help us slow down the rate of climate change even more effectively than carbon removal can. So other reasons to grow seaweed, even though we're uncertain about all these products, we need a lot more research to demonstrate and quantify those climate mitigation effects I'm hypothesizing about. Again, it's worth doing seaweed farming because it's already profitable for people. It doesn't need a carbon market. And it does all these other things. It removes nitrogen from highly eutrophied waters. It provides habitat for fishes under some conditions. And it can even alleviate ocean acidification locally if the seaweed is dense enough, again, through this rapid absorption of carbon dioxide, which is acidic in the water. So let me end by just walking through the field research that we're doing to test these ideas. We decided to work in this area in the central Philippines for a number of reasons. One is we have had staff that are working for 10 years to improve the fisheries. The fisheries have been depleted. There's remarkable progress now, so there's some hope that those fisheries will come back. But these communities are highly vulnerable to typhoons, and they've had several in the last several years. They're even more vulnerable because the mangrove forests have been degraded in this area, and that has removed that buffering capacity, the storm surge suppression that mangroves can offer to coastal communities. They also have pretty degraded seagrass meadows, and there's not many other economic opportunities for these folks. They're very, very dependent on these fisheries that are now not producing very much fish because of the depletion. So this is part of EDF's Climate Justice Initiative, wherein we develop many more of our resources and staff time to trying to help communities that are on the short end of the climate justice stick. The industrialized countries having benefited from emitting lots of greenhouse gases over the last 100 years, developing their economies, prospering, and also being winners in climate change because of that prosperity and because a lot of fish species are moving poleward from the tropics. The tropics, on the other hand, contributed very little to the climate change problem, but are now suffering disproportionately from the impacts. And so we view it as kind of a moral imperative to try to help these communities become more resilient, to withstand and adapt to the inevitable climate change effects that they're experiencing, and to be part of the climate solution. So in order to address these questions, we created a demonstration seaweed farm in this place called Cabalian Bay there in Leyte province. We're growing a red seaweed called Capophycus. It's growing very, very rapidly. In this tiny little farm of ours, it's only about 20 meters by 30 meters. We got about a ton of seaweed in 2 months. So the stuff grows fast. We are monitoring carbon absorption by the crop, and we harvested the crop and are going to turn it into biostimulants and apply that to crops to try to measure the greenhouse gas effects and the crop yield effects of applying that biostimulant to the crops there. We're also, as part of our strategy in scaling this up, measuring the revenues that the local community can make from selling the seaweed into the agar market. We're also examining ways to vertically integrate seaweed product production in this community, because right now they're what's known as price takers, right? They're selling raw seaweed or dried seaweed into commodity markets. They take whatever price they can get from the supply chain, the middleman, the aggregators. And that means that the local communities only get a small fraction of the value that they're creating by their hard work and by farming these seaweed. So by vertically integrating some of these industrial processes, we can shorten that supply chain, allow these local communities to capture more of the economic value of that crop and hopefully sell higher value products into other markets. We're also measuring all the ecosystem services. So how much oxygen is the seaweed farm producing? What are the biodiversity impacts? Is it really removing nutrients from the water to keep water quality high? And is it affecting pH at all? So the key questions we're trying to answer after we get those data from the field trial is, where can we scale up this model? And where can we gain the benefits of these seaweed farming while avoiding all those constraints around conflicts with other marine resource users? So we did this spatial analysis. It's still under development, so not published yet. But it suggests that, as I said, when you layer all those constraints onto a map of the ocean, and then you add the areas of the ocean where light and nutrients are sufficient to support seagrass meadows, you end up with a map of the areas that can be farmed with very minimal conflict with other marine uses. And in this, we're developing a tool by which it's possible to weight each of the criteria. So if you care mostly about climate mitigation, you can put more weight on that criterion. It'll show you the areas that are close to deposition basins, that are close enough to shore, that the greenhouse gas emissions associated with farming the seaweed and then transporting the seaweed do not outweigh the climate mitigation benefits of growing the seaweed in the first place, and so forth. If you care more about conflicts with fishing grounds, you can weight that criterion to avoid those conflicts. So we think that this is going to be a fairly useful planning tool for policymakers to make rational decisions about where to put seaweed farms, where to subsidize people to grow seaweed without conflicting with other marine uses. Now, this is not a panacea, of course, you know, especially when you scale something up, like an individual seaweed farm of the size we're dealing with in the Philippines is not going to have much effect on anything. It's too tiny. But the idea here is to scale it up to the point where it actually can have a significant effect on people's livelihoods and on the climate system. So some of the risks that we are concerned about are shading other natural ecosystems. You know, when you grow seaweed in a dense mat like that, enough to be commercially viable, you can shade out seagrasses and other light-dependent ecosystems. These seaweeds are so good at absorbing nutrients that there is some evidence of nutrient competition with natural phytoplankton. So there's no free lunch. If the seaweeds take up the nutrients, there's less available for the natural food web. And so we want to try to find areas that have excess nutrients from agricultural production so that we can avoid that trade-off and also solve that environmental problem at the same time. With scale up, you know, there is risk of entanglement. There's not too much evidence that aquaculture entangles marine mammals or sharks or turtles. But if they truly become massive, you know, we're dealing with ropes in the water, we're dealing with infrastructure, boats, all these things can have impacts on marine wildlife at scale. One of the biggest risks of this whole theory of turning seaweed into products that mitigate climate change is that it depends on human behavior. So we can make the best product in the world, we can show that it's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but if people don't use it, it's not going to have any effect. And even if people use these products, but they don't substitute it for the conventional product, it's not going to have any climate mitigation effect. I'll give you an example. So if a farmer is growing crops using commercial fertilizer with all the bad things that happen with commercial fertilizer use, and we give them a biostimulant and they see a 30 or 40% increase in crop growth, will they then say, I can reduce my fertilizer use, save some money, and get the same or higher yield? Or are they so afraid of losing any yield and the fertilizer is cheap enough that they just apply the same amount of fertilizer? That eliminates that whole sparing effect and really reduces the greenhouse gas benefits of that product. So this is why we need to do life cycle analyses of all these pathways. We also have to understand how farmers, people who use plastics, manufacture concrete products, and all these substitutes or the conventional analogs of the products we're trying to substitute the seaweed products for, how they're going to react to these new products, because so much of the benefits depend on that human behavior change. Let me end there and see if there are questions, right? And thanks for your attention.
All right, I'm going to turn the house lights on so we can see each other and have a discussion. And we're going to bounce back and forth between folks online and folks in the room for questions. So I can see that Roseanne has a question for us already. So go ahead, Roseanne.
About mediation of local acidification. What's known about the scale of local influence, scale of meters, tens of meters, 100 meters, 1 kilometer?
Yeah, good question. There have been not many studies studying the entire halo. I mean, that's what we want to do at our farm, is just take measurements from the inside of the farm out as far as we can detect the effect and define that halo Like how far does that effect extend? Unfortunately, very few studies. The only studies that have really documented this effect on ocean acidification in a robust way are in China, and they tend to just measure conditions inside the farm and adjacent to the farm. That's really all we got. So we're going to depend on seaweed farmers who are interested in allowing research to do research in their farms to do those kinds of studies that are necessary to characterize the spatial extent of the pH effect. And it's important because, you know, if seaweeds are able to remediate ocean acidification, you know, and if that helps oyster farming, then you would want that effect to spread to the water in which the oysters are growing. Otherwise, it's not going to have an effect. If it's too local, it's not a big benefit.
All right, all the hands went up. Okay, hang on just a second. Bob, you have a mic. Go ahead.
Rod, yeah, thanks very much. I think first of all, I just want to say you've done a really nice job of showing the holistic approach that you take and environmental defense is taking in not just looking at, say, the environmental quality, but the impact on human life, on the economy, how all those have to come together. And I really appreciate that. And it makes me think, going back to the one figure you had of the 5 different models, global models of where it would be good, it seemed that the higher latitudes were the more productive. They're perhaps, in my mind, they seem like they might be a little more challenging, though, in that. So are you optimistic that we can expand this into those higher latitudes?
Yeah, I'm focused on the tropics because of the long growing season. So that's the trade-off, right? So you have these very nutrient rich waters in the upwelling zones and in the temperate zones. So you get these higher productivity estimates, but you can only grow seaweed for like a couple of months. So the people are growing kelp in Northern Europe, in the UK, here in the US. The focus is on sugar kelp, you know, and Long Island Sound and so forth. And on the West Coast here, people are growing bull kelp and also sugar kelp. So the kelps, you know, are great, but they have this shorter growing season, then they fall apart. In the tropics, you can grow these seaweeds all year round. And yeah, they're not quite as productive, but they do grow very fast. But you can kind of minimize that trade-off. So yeah, but you know, despite these trade-offs and constraints, I think there's enough area of the ocean that is farmable without those constraints that it can scale. I don't know how big that's going to be. It's an open question. But just as an example, the potential farmable area under all those constraints in our model, right, is about 500 times bigger than the current footprint of the entire global seaweed farming community. So that tells me that there's probably room to grow. Yeah.
Okay, Roseanne, go ahead.
How sensitive to sea level rise will seaweed farming be, or can the methods adjust as sea levels change and areas are inundated?
Well, this is one of the constraints on the scalability of nearshore systems, right? So mangroves and salt marshes and seagrasses are all in danger of getting quote unquote drowned by sea level rise. Well, not mangroves, seagrasses and salt marshes and coral reefs, because they need to be, you know, they need enough light to grow, and if the sea level is rising faster than their vertical accretion rate, they lose, right? The net productivity goes down. Seaweed beds, natural ones, are also subject to that constraint and are vulnerable to sea level rise. But our farm floats, right? And in fact, it's designed so that we can submerge it or raise it to avoid high storm surge and keep it intact. And a lot of the newer seaweed farms are designed in that same way, not so much to deal with sea level rise, but just to protect the crop when the storm surge gets too high. But that technology makes you resilient to sea level rise. It doesn't really matter, right, for a seaweed farm that's designed in that way.
All right, go ahead, Gail. Here, just
take this. We talked about nori farming in the 80s. Before I came here, I was involved in that. And one of the major problems, you put these big nets out at sea, fishermen are not happy about that. And you have an extensive area, probably perfect for fishing as well. And you'd think that to save, to change global change, sea level, to change, to help the earth, they would allow seaweed farming. But I suspect there'll be a huge fight about any of this with fishermen. We've had that problem a lot. Have you run into that in the tropics?
No, and the answer that I would give is that it's very context dependent. Those conflicts are very context dependent. So here I know that there's the common public trust doctrine is prevalent in this country. The ocean is there for everyone to use, and fishermen and historical users get precedence, right? But that's not true in other parts of the world. They have different attitudes toward how the ocean resource is governed. And so in the Philippines, it's really not a commons area. It's divided into jurisdictions that are governed by the mayors. In Chile, same thing. There's a national law that creates these turfs that are controlled by local authorities. So the governance systems and thereby the conflicts and the perception of who gets priority in the nearshore open space varies tremendously from country to country. Now, in the Philippines, the fishermen actually like our farm because the fisheries are so depleted that they've noticed the aggregation effect around our farm, and their catch rates have gone up. So we see a lot of fishermen fishing right on the borders of our farm, even though it's tiny. It's kind of sad that that they're so desperate for fish that they can think they can capitalize on that. What we're trying to do in the Philippines is use technology that's very similar to the technology the fishermen have used to make what are called fish aggregating devices. Now, this is a dirty word in the environmental community because they're actually more like fish depleting devices. So they put these structures out in the bay in the nearshore area, and they shine these powerful lights at night. And so all these fish kind of come in, and after they depleted all the grouper and the snapper and the desirable species, they're now catching little herring and sardines and everything that's left. So it's a really good way to completely decimate fish populations. We're trying to kind of turn swords into plowshares here, though, by using the FAD technology and then creating biogenic habitat on top of that so that they become productive habitat rather than just an attractant that makes it easier to kill fish. So the fishermen are kind of bought into that. They look just like the FADs that they build all the time, except that they have stuff growing on them, and they seem to be okay with it.
Hang on just a second, Gail.
Are any of the algae you farm food for fish?
Oh, yeah.
Because they eat herbivore, they're herbivorous down there, so
Yeah.
that might be useful.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons why it's productive habitat for the fishes. We actually have a little bit of too much herbivory going on at the farm right now, and we're trying to mitigate that by using different meshes and stuff to protect especially the young seaweeds are really vulnerable to that. But it's part of the trade-off, right? It's like share with the ocean. Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Roseanne.
Okay, staying with the Philippines project, at what point will the Philippines pilot be deemed replicable elsewhere, and what determines success of the Philippines pilot? And at what point will those key learnings be applicable to other similar areas?
Yeah, great question. We're hoping to wrap up the research phase of the Philippines project by the end of this calendar year. And then we have some livelihood consultants working with us who are scoping out community interest. It always seems to be high in a preliminary way. But the real measure of success for the viability of this farm to be a scalable model is not all the scientific data we're collecting. It's really profit, can you make a profit growing seaweeds in this way? And especially we want to see if there's local interest in making this biostimulant instead of selling the seaweed into the usual commodity market for agar. And so we're developing business models. We're collecting, cost and revenue data. We're examining local markets. And if we can get a local entrepreneur to take over this seaweed farm, then we'll count that as a step toward scalability. The next step will be to create an ambassador program, much like they use in, to spread better farming techniques in Africa, right? You use peer-to-peer learning, and no seaweed farmer is going to listen to me talk about how great seaweed farming is. They got to hear it from another seaweed farmer who's actually been successful. And so that's the idea behind this peer exchange mechanism that we use to scale projects like this.
Hi, I have 2 questions. One piggybacks off of that. So many years ago, I was visiting fishing communities in Indonesia, and we saw something similar to the picture you had up there because they depleted out all of their local stocks and were looking for alternative livelihoods. And they had tried it for a year, but then failed because the crops got disease and things. And so they were looking to us for, guidance on how to do that, which we felt terrible at the time. We had no way to help them or guide them on how to do their seaweed farming because it was not something we've been trained in. So kind of building off that question, I was wondering kind of what that piece looks like that you're testing and scaling, like in terms of training or testing out farming practices. It's a whole new industry for a lot of folks. And so I think there'd be a lot of desire out there to pick this up. And I have a follow-up question to that also.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. That is a huge issue throughout the tropics, this ice disease. It's one of the major reasons why seaweed production has leveled off in that whole area over recent years. The other reason is that China processing capacity is down, and that's the major buyer. So we, again, as Bob said, we try to take a kind of a holistic view of this. And so we understand that it's no good teaching people how to seaweed farm if the whole crop is going to die because of disease. So we've done a deeper analysis as to why this disease is spreading, and it seems to be related in part to the lack of supply of really high quality propagules. So what happens in the Philippines is that these middlemen control the supply of the propagules. The seaweed farmers buy the young seaweeds from them, and they're assured that they're really high quality and they're just out of the hatchery and so forth. But most of the time they're not. They're just fragments that are vegetatively propagated from some other stock that's not that healthy. And so that helps to spread the disease. It really constrains, there's no selective breeding that's going on in the Philippines right now, which is key to developing strains that are resistant to disease. So we're consulting with tropical seaweed experts. We're working with this other outfit called Hatch Blue to create a tropical seaweed resilience network to share information about best practices and to create a better supply of high quality propagules to try to combat the initiation of this disease, and then to find better ways to do strain selection to prevent the spread of the disease. So it's a tough problem, but we are trying to address it in those ways.
Thank you. And then going back to the plots that you had, or the maps, kind of the high likelihood of success zones. In terms of thinking about this as another form of livelihood for, depleted fisheries, or kind of the win-win you talked about, there's probably a whole bunch of fisheries out there, a whole bunch of communities who would love to embody this and carry it forward. Although the map up there is kind of the opposite of what I would think is that win-win zone of like helping a community and getting out there. So I'm curious in EDF's vision, would you still pursue that as an alternative livelihood intervention in the Pacific and in coral island communities? Or are you really going to focus your effort in those high likelihood zones?
Yeah, my first comment is like, don't invest too much in that map because it's based on floor scale global data and it's meant for illustrative purposes only. We're actually trying to use that map to create a better estimate of global seaweed carbon sequestration potential. And we're going to try to ground truth it with this remote sensing approach that we're trying to use machine learning to identify and count seaweed farms to estimate their area to improve that estimate in conjunction with those maps. So to really figure out where to grow seaweed, you cannot use data that's that coarse. That's on the 10-kilometer resolution. You need to go into these local communities and find out from the farmers and from the local scientists what kind of really granular data they have on where lighter nutrients are available, where the conflicts are actually occurring in the industrial areas. I think that, when we do those analyses, we'll find that there's plenty of room to expand, particularly as we get out of that very narrow nearshore area where so many of the farms are located right now, and move slightly offshore with different kinds of technology that are resilient to those conditions.
All right, Roseanne, go ahead.
Do you think there's a need to better quantify how much carbon can actually get removed from the discussed processes? For example, to the sediment as an actual sink, in order to determine how many square miles of seaweed or kelp would have to be maintained to make a dent into the global carbon budget. The percentage in the Zhang figure seems to be too high. Thinks it's 10%.
Yeah, there's a big problem with the current set of estimates for how much seaweed carbon is sequestered, because a lot of those estimates in the literature are carbon absorption. So I try to make a big deal out of it to this audience that is not carbon sequestration, that's carbon absorption, and only a fraction of that carbon gets sequestered. You have to estimate that fraction. You also have to estimate how much of that carbon actually comes out of the atmosphere, because it's not coming from the atmosphere directly, right? So these are some of the major questions that need to be answered. The answer is yes, we do need a better estimate of global carbon sequestration potential based on a better understanding of those dynamics and better data. And we don't even have the basic numbers we need right now. We have some point estimates of carbon sequestration from about 20 farms around the world, that's it. And we don't have a good estimate of the number of farms in the world, right? We think it's about 6,000 square kilometers, but we don't know. It's based on really faulty government statistics. And so that's why we're trying to use remote sensing to count, and machine learning to count up those farms and give us a better estimate of the total area, so we can multiply that by the sequestration rate and get this number and see if it is a significant, if it's at the gigaton scale, or if it's a couple of 100 million metric tons. We don't even know.
All right, everyone. I noticed our time, and I know that there's still questions online and there's still questions in the room, but I'm going to hand it back to you, Rod. Is there anything you want to just wrap up with us before we end this seminar today?
Well, I would just say that I hope this has stimulated some research ideas in this audience. That was really my purpose coming here today, is to, yes, receive the award, but also to meet new people and kind of socialize this idea that this is an important issue, in my view, that really could use more high quality research of the kind that you do here at Hatfield. And I hope it's provided some inspiration and some new thinking, and happy to talk to you online, by email, or whatever, if there's interest. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody. For the students in the room, we have the student lunch that's going to be happening. So if you have signed up for that, we'll be over in the library seminar room shortly. So you can make your way there. And for everybody else, thank you so much for being here. We'll see you next week.